What does it mean for us that Jesus was a refugee? For those of us who are Christian, it means that we believe in a God who was forced to flee his home as a child. It means that not only does our God love and care for the destitute, the homeless, and the displaced, but in fact, our God has lived the experience of displacement. It means that we worship a displaced God, a God who is a stranger, an outsider, who started life cold and lost, homeless, rootless. How does it change our faith when we worship a homeless God? For those of us who are not Christian, knowing that Jesus was a refugee has an equally strong impact. What does it mean that we learn from, praise, hold up a figure who was a refugee? When so often we praise and emulate those with money and power and prestige, what does it teach us to instead model our lives on one who is rootless, homeless, and lost, wandering in another land, fleeing the reckless violence of an empire? When we turn to Jesus as a source of guidance for our life, we are hearing the wisdom of the powerless, the depth of knowledge that comes from being forgotten, the truth of what it feels like to live outside of privilege. The fact that Jesus was a refugee should lead us to a radical faith. It should lead us to live our lives as rebels against the powers of violence and privilege. Although our actions may be small in scope or grand by design, either way, being a disciple of Jesus should be countercultural. Our spirituality should lead us to welcome strangers and to build structures and systems that will prevent any more children from having to flee violence. We should be working to end the root causes that make people leave their homelands and flee violence. The story of Jesus needing to flee to Egypt has very little historical backing. Like the rest of our sacred text, it should not be taken as literal historical fact. Historians do not know if it really happened, and if it did happen, if it happened the way that we are told. But it does not need to be literally true in order to teach us about how we should live our lives. It does not need to be literally true to teach us about our faith and how our faith should lead us into action. You know what is striking to me about this story? It's striking how familiar it is. Have any of the rest of you been following the Syrian refugee crisis? Have you heard a story about a family having to flee violence? A family with babies, small children, fleeing from their homeland, ending up in refugee camps, desperate, hungry, displaced. This is the story that we hear in this part of Matthew, and it is a story that is still true. Almost 2,000 years later, this story could have happened yesterday. I don't know about you, but I find that pretty depressing. I think the trick is to not fall into inaction, not to fall into a sense of hopelessness, even though we've seen history repeat itself over and over again. Because the story of a displaced Messiah, it should galvanize us into action. It should wake us up from our comfortable patterns of belief that lead us to judge who is moral and who is not, who is worthy of our compassion and who is not. All of Jesus' teachings, they remind us of the power of our actions. We are reminded in the Gospels that peace is possible, that love wins over violence and hate, and that compassion will bring us life. We are reminded that our God is a God of love. We are reminded that God cares deeply for all of creation. When we envision Jesus as a refugee, this provides us with a narrative of faith that roots our spiritual life in the care for those who are struggling. See, Scripture reminds us, blessed are the poor and blessed are the meek. But the story of Mary and Joseph and the baby Jesus fleeing to Egypt, this provides us with an illustration of God's deep empathy for those who are displaced. This is the illustration of blessed are the poor and blessed are the meek. Jesus was a refugee. And for those of us who have a home, those of us with roots, those of us with a community, those of us living in our homelands, we should remember that Jesus is not like us. So often we make God in our own image, a privileged, blue-eyed Jesus who somehow seems to care about the things that we care about and somehow seems to respond in the ways that we have been taught to respond. Instead, I think the truth is much more challenging than that. For those of us who are privileged white Americans, we should be profoundly challenged. We should be disconcerted. We should be troubled by this dark-skinned refugee baby who grows up to be a countercultural rebel. We should be challenged by this every day and every time we pick up the Gospels. This challenge, it should sing in our hearts. It should prick our conscience to deeper compassion and care. This should be the seed of love that is planted in our hearts. We should be troubled and challenged so that next time we see someone who is displaced, the next time we drive by someone homeless or destitute standing on a street corner, we see the face of Jesus. May we encounter Christ on the street. May we find God in the faces of the Syrian refugees who we see on TV. and the refugee families who we meet here in Greensboro. May we see the divine light shining from the face of the poor and the struggling, the meek, and the forgotten. Jesus was a refugee. Our God is a God of the lost. Our God is a God of the meek. Our God is a God of the peacemakers. Our God is a God of those who welcome. Our God is a God of the homeless. Our God is love. Our truth is welcome. Our call is peace. Our testimony to the world is one of integrity in the face of fear, and courage in the face of hatred. Jesus was a refugee.